So thanks everyone for your patience. We are running 5 minutes behind, but that's all right. Full day of activity here in residency mode. For those of you just joining us, bonjour et bienvenue. And on behalf of ForSpace and the In.Site Residency Planning Committee, welcome everyone in person. So great to see you here or via Zoom to Mapping Concordia's Sustainability Ecosystem with Karine Balé. Karine is here in the space with us. And since we started a little bit later, I think I'll just forego my official intro to pass it to her so we can get going. And just letting you know, if you are joining us in the space though and you'd like to contribute a comment or a question, just raise a hand and we'll get a microphone to you. It's important so that the live stream, we can hear you on the live stream and on the Zoom. Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks Karine, welcome.
Thank you. Hi everyone. Really happy to be here today. Today I'm going to talk about a project that I got to work on over the past year as part of the Sustainability Ambassadors Program at Concordia. So I'm really happy to talk about this project. So a little bit about me, I'm in my last year of economics. I'll be graduating by the end of the semester, so it's very exciting for me to be able to talk about my final project at university. So before we get started, I want to start by acknowledging that we are located on unceded indigenous lands that historically belong to the Guinea-Kehaga Nation. I also want to acknowledge that Montreal, also known as Jojake, has been a gathering place for many First Nations. So as we go through this exercise of attempting to map sustainability at Concordia, well, it's important that we keep in mind our relationship with indigenous populations. So let's just get started. And basically, this project came from the idea that sustainability is complex, so we need a way of understanding it. And I think that mapping sustainability is a great way for us to get started. And today, I'm going to talk about 3 things just to drive my point forward. The first thing is I'm going to tell you why it's important to map sustainability. The second thing is I'm going to talk about systems theory, which is the base theory that I'm using to approach mapping sustainability. And then I'm going to walk you through what I call Concordia's sustainability ecosystem. So before we get started, just to gauge like level of knowledge in the room, how many of you are familiar with my project? Hands up. Okay, a couple of people here. So let's talk about the importance of mapping sustainability. Why is it important to map sustainability? Anyone thought about it? Any idea? What do we do when we're mapping something? Don't be shy. Yeah?
We find links.
Yeah, we find links. Any other idea? Yeah?
Finding where we stand.
I love that, finding where we stand. So let me give you an example. I use Google Maps a lot because I get lost. I have 0 sense of orientation. So when you're accessing Google Map, what you're doing is you're accessing Google's view of what the world is, right? So you're accessing Google's view of what Montreal looks like, and you're able to situate yourself within that environment. And sometimes Google Map is wrong, right? So sometimes Google will tell you, well, there's a restaurant right next to this, like at this corner, and then you look at the physical world and the restaurant is actually closed, right? So sometimes Google Map can be wrong, but one thing that it allows us to do as a community and as a society is, well, we have this medium through which we can see what Google sees as being the world, and we can then communicate to Google and be like, well, actually this is not true, and maybe you should adapt that knowledge, right? So that's why it's important to map sustainability. Mapping sustainability allows us to get to that common level of understanding of what sustainability means, and then it allows us to collaborate and think about ways that we can improve what the system looks like. So just to drive this one forward, Tristan Harris, he's the founder of the Center for Humane Technology, and he's done amazing work around how sustainability and how technology actually affects us in our daily lives. And he said, our ability to meet the world's challenges depends on us making sense and coordinating together. So there are 2 important pieces here. The first one is making sense, and then the second one is coordinating together. So if we go back to the example of talking about Google, well, Google helps us make sense of the world and then coordinate how we're going to approach living this world. So that's why it's important to map sustainability. So one of the advantage that we get when we're using mapping as a methodology to approach sustainability is that, yes, we get a clearer sense of the world. And it's important because increasingly our world is becoming more and more complicated, right? So if you're familiar with the field of ecology or policy work, sustainability is what we call a wicked problem. And what a wicked problem is, it's a problem that is really hard to understand and sometimes impossible to solve, or at least that's what people would think, for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that, well, when you're approaching such a problem such as this one, well, sometimes you have incomplete information. So it's really hard to solve a problem that you don't really understand. Another reason is that, well, the requirements to solve wicked problems tend to change a lot because the world is evolving. So that adds a layer of difficulty. Another characteristic of wicked problem is that, well, solutions are not final when you're trying to solve a wicked problem. So let's talk about poverty, for example. Is there such a number that we can say that if we raise minimum income to this number, poverty is going to be solved all over the world forever? It's really hard to come up with a number such as this one, right? Because you have cultural context and then some regions of the world are in war, so it's very hard to come up with that type of number and save poverty forever. And it's the same thing when we're talking about sustainability. So mapping sustainability allows us to come to what we call a defined knowledge domain. So what we're doing is we're defining the problem and we're making sure that everybody has a clear understanding of what it is that we're trying to tackle. So it allows us to set up rules when we're trying to look at sustainability. And then the second thing is it allows us to share knowledge, right? So once you have this medium through which people can understand how you view sustainability, well, now we can have conversation and start to think about how we're going to make change, you know, and make stuff better. So these are the advantages of mapping sustainability. So just to start this exploration of mapping Concordia's sustainability ecosystem, it's important for us to understand how we define sustainability. And to define sustainability, what I've done is I've used the definition that we find on the Sustainability Action Plan, so the one that we published at Concordia. And basically, there are three important points that we need to understand when we're approaching sustainability, at least at Concordia. The first thing is that sustainability means taking care of nature. So we're going to make sure that we're reducing our ecological footprint. The second thing is we're going to make sure that we're enhancing social well-being. So we're taking care of ourselves and taking care of each other. And then the last portion is we're going to make sure that it's economically viable to do both of these things. And obviously you can ask the question, is it even possible to take care of nature, take care of each other and community, as well as being economically viable? And that's a question worth asking, but just for the purpose of this presentation, we're not going to talk about that. So let me summarize. So when we're talking about mapping sustainability, what we're doing is we're approaching this from having an information management strategy. So we're saying to all the actors that are involved in the space, this is what we're going to look like, and we're stating the problem, and then we're giving them a medium through which they can approach solving the problem. So that's it about mapping sustainability. Now let's talk about systems theory. So that's the base theory that I'm using to approach mapping sustainability. Any idea, what's a system? I like to ask questions, so don't be afraid. There's no wrong answer. I mean, there is, but I won't be mean. So any idea, what's a system? Yeah? Relationship developments, yeah, I like that. That's part of a system.
That was all I had.
Anyone else? Yeah.
In some ways, it's a formalized routine.
I like that, formalized routine. So let me give you an answer. So basically, down-to-earth answer, a system is just a bunch of things that are interacting and sometimes interdependent, and at the end, they form this complex thing that we call a system. So that's basically what it is. So the key lesson of systems theory, and basically systems theory is the study of systems. So we're going to look at their behaviors and different interactions, and we're trying to understand what is happening. So the key concept of systems theory is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So let me give you an example. Let's say you were 4 years old and I put a bunch of ingredients on this table to make a cake, So I put flour, I have sugar, I have milk, I have all these things, and you've never baked a cake in your life. You don't have access to internet, you don't know what is going on. So if you put all these ingredients together in a random order, you're not getting a cake. You're not getting this complex system that we call a cake, right? You have to know how these elements are interacting in order to get to this complex system that we call a cake with different flavor, texture, and all this beauty that comes with cakes. So that's what I mean by the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So let me give you other examples of systems. So the first one that I have here is just a forest. So forest is a complex system where you have trees, you have animals, you have the soil that are interacting and forming this complex system that we call a forest. And if we look at the tree itself, well, the tree is complex, right? And the tree tells us some things about the forest. It can tell you a bit about the health of the forest and where the forest is going. But just by looking at the tree, you don't get the full picture of what is going on with your system. So once again, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The second example that I have here is just the ocean, right? Where you have fish and you have all this aquatic life and the water that are interacting together to form this complex system that we call the ocean. And by the way, that is responsible for regulating temperature on Earth. So we're talking about a very complex system here. And then the last example that I have here, and I had to mention this because I'm an economics student, is just the economy, right? Where I would be an agent and we would all be agents and we are interacting to form this complex system that we call the economy. So these are examples of systems. So there are a couple of characteristics that are important when we look at systems. And I'm not going to talk about complexity and interactiveness because I feel like we've already talked about that. But I'm going to talk about adaptiveness, and that's my personal favorite characteristics when we talk about system. So just to give you an example, I started rock climbing recently, and if you've ever been rock climbing, you know that it's very easy to get hurt. You can cut yourself very easily, but I've always been fascinated by this capacity that my body has to regenerate itself. So that's what we mention when we're talking about adaptiveness, right? So systems, especially natural systems, because it's really, really hard to replicate that when we're talking about human-made systems. Well, natural systems are able to adapt themselves to changes that are going on and to respond to these changes. So that's adaptiveness. The second characteristic that I do want to talk about is non-linearity. So non-linearity is a bit hard to understand, but basically it's talking about the butterfly effect. So what it's saying is that it's very hard to anticipate the trajectory of a system. So if you apply an action on the system, it could have a huge effect on the system and be detrimental to the system, or it could have no effect. So that's non-linearity. And just to give you an example, we've always had infectious disease, but if you've been following what has been going on in the medical field, microbes and infections are starting to be resistant to antibiotics, right? So that's non-linearity. We had a problem with infections, and we said, okay, we're going to use antibiotics. And as an answer to that, which is non-linearity, well, the system was like, okay, I'm going to adapt and resist, and that's unexpected events that are happening with systems. So that makes it hard to predict where they're going to go. So these are characteristics of systems. And let's talk about how we can use that in the context of mapping. And when we're talking about system mapping, what we're doing is basically we're building a simplified representation of the real world. So by definition, it's a model, right? And all models are wrong, but they can be useful. Because you're simplifying the real world, obviously it's not going to be accurate, but it can be useful in order for you to have an idea of what is going on. So what we're doing when we're mapping systems is we're going through this collaborative and data-driven process through which we're mapping real-world interactions and events and corporations and organizations, and we're trying to anticipate changes within the systems. And we're trying to understand what are some strengths and what are some potential weaknesses associated with systems. So that's what we're doing when we're mapping systems. So hopefully now you know what systems theory is and you have an idea of what we're doing when we're mapping system. So let's talk about Concordia's sustainability ecosystem and how we go about mapping that ecosystem. So when I was working on that project, I discovered a tool that allowed me to map ecosystem called Kumu. And I really want to talk about this tool because I just think it's really cool. So Kumu is an open source software, and the reason why it's important to mention that it's open source is that when I was working on this project, some of the feedback that I got from people that had already seen attempt of mapping sustainability at Concordia was that, well, some of those people that were mapping sustainability were using proprietary software. And one of the problems that you run into when you're doing that is, well, when you leave, it's really hard to pick up your project and try to update it. So Kumu is an open source software, which makes it way much easier when you're trying to share information and make sure that other people can replicate your project. Another characteristic of Kumu is that it's sector specific, which means that Kumu is basically a tool that is made for us to understand our messy world. So it really has everything that you need to map systems, which is amazing because you don't have to struggle to build the representation that you want to build. And then the last thing, not the last thing, but the third thing is longevity, right? So when you're building a project such as this one, you want to make sure that the software that you're using is going to be here for a long time. You don't want it to disappear. And Kumu is actually used by Harvard Business School. It's used by the government of Canada. You can actually find some of the maps that the government has created on this tool. So it made me feel really reassured when I was using this tool and putting my map on it. And then the last reason why I decided to use Kumu was just because of pricing, right? So Kumu is totally free, so feel free to use it if you do want to play around with system maps. Before we move forward, I do want to show you a map that someone did, just to show you how cool Kumu can be. So you should be able to see it. But basically, this is a map of Austin's social innovation ecosystem map. So this is a very cool map that has a lot of moving elements. And I'm not going to dive into what this map represents, but basically, someone wanted to map sustainability and social innovation in Austin, Texas. And the red dots represent organizations that are working around social innovation, and then the blue dots represent just people associated with these organizations. So that's just an example of the beautiful modelization that you can do when you're using Kumu. So let me share the rest of. Okay. So now let's look at what sustainability looks like at Concordia. So when you click on the link, and by the way, I was just told that my map was on the school's website, so I'm very excited for that, and thank you for the people working at the Office of Sustainability for that work. But this is what it looks like when you click on the presentation, and I'm going to skip everything. But this is what it looks like. This is what I call Concordia's sustainability ecosystem. And what I wanted to do here was I wanted to challenge that hierarchical view that we have of sustainability and just put everything at the same level, right? So what we have here is sustainability at the center with its definition, and all the organizations are involved in the system. And then sustainability is branching out into these different streams that are inspired from the Sustainability Action Plan. So we have research, we have food, waste management and resource, curriculum and course support, sustainability funding and advocacy, climate, hands-on learning opportunities, and peer support. And then as nodes to all these streams, you have the different organizations that are working in these sectors. So at the top of the screen here, you can filter through by organizations. So if I only click on community partnerships, you can see which organizations are working in that domain. If I click on fee levy groups, you can have an idea of who is working in the fee levy, as a fee levy working towards sustainability at Concordia. So this is what it looks like. We can definitely come back to it during the question period, but I wanted to show you what sustainability looks like at Concordia. So just to conclude here, why is it important to map sustainability? It's important to map sustainability for a couple of reasons. The first one is that it allows us to understand the state of the problem, so we get to that common understanding of what sustainability means. And then the second reason is it allows us to share knowledge, right? So once we understand what sustainability looks like at Concordia, now we can find areas for improvement and ways to collaborate with each other. So for example, on this map, I realized that we did not have a lot of organizations that were focused solely on climate change, but we have a lot of organizations that are focused on making sure that we have healthy and affordable food at the school. And then the last reason why it's important to map sustainability is because it's just a fun project to do, isn't it? I got to work with so many people when I was working on this project, and just the collaboration and how fun it was to put everything together makes it worth it. So that's all I had to say today. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Hello. Okay, I don't have a question. I'm just joining Karine. Quickly, I'll pop over here. Okay. So I have a couple of questions for Karine, who I had the pleasure of working with her as this project came to life. For those who don't know me, my name is Meredith Marti-Dugas. I am within the Office of Sustainability, and I am the Sustainability Ambassadors Program Coordinator. See, we're already here with the very long titles, and it was really exciting to see this map come together because I, in my work, working with students, trying to get them familiar with all of the opportunities in general, get exhausted even just in the process of explaining. So this map, I think, is actually going to be something that's extremely useful for us to be able to explain that process, especially for visual learners, what they can get involved with. So I think my first question is, from the start of your project, when you were really like building your initial idea to your final project, how did the, I think, motivation or like structure behind the map change as you learned more about systems mapping, as well as like the coding that was necessary to complete it?
That's a good question, and I think that's a complicated question. So I think when I'm a visual learner, just like you mentioned, so I think when I started, I just wanted to have a medium through which we could all discover sustainability, because when I started at university, like, I didn't even know what sustainability meant. Like, my first language is French. I didn't even know the world. So, but when I dived into that world, I was like, oh, this is actually really cool. And there's need for discovery when it comes to sustainability, and we need people involved in that space. So I think when I started, I didn't think necessarily of that interactive portion of the map and making sure that there's like nice colors and everything. So I don't know. It's a hard question, but I think I wanted to have like a visual, just like a plain simple visual map, but the more I learned about the tool, which is Kumu, the more I dived into, creating beautiful just pictures and making sure that we had all the information that we needed in order for us to discover sustainability. And I think also just talking to people, all the people working at on sustainability at Concordia really helped shape this map. And by the way, like, this is like version 1 of the map, but we have like a couple of different versions. So it was also interesting to see how students preferred like the version that I just showed, which is version 1, and then people working in sustainability and really familiar with the structure preferred like another version that was like, I don't know, more complex to understand, but for us it made more sense. So it's just interesting to see how like different people have different design needs, and I think it goes back to the fact that like models are wrong, but like adjusting the way you're viewing an ecosystem can be useful for different types of people to understand what is going on.
Hello. Okay, great. I really love what you say about the idea of models being wrong, and the way that that sort of gives us the opportunity to fail repeatedly as we try and build these types of communication. I think, you know, especially living under capitalism, there's this expectation that we're doing it right and perfect and fast each time. And so I'm curious for you, as you were sort of developing this project, was there a place where you felt like you made a mistake or you failed? And what would you do differently now based on what you've learned from that experience?
I think if I had to do it again, I would spend like more time just learning the tool, because I think I just dived into it and I was like, oh, I'm going to do this really cool thing and like it's going to be easy, and then it started taking like a couple of months and I was like, oh my god, this is actually really hard, and like I had to learn coding for this now. So I think if I were to do it again, I would like spend more time just researching the tool and like learning the tutorials and like learning all the different things we can do with that. But at the same time, like it's important to fail, right, and to try different things. So.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, for us working together through the program, it was really important that we made sure that we took on your work as an office, because for those of us who have been working in sustainability at Concordia for a while, as Karine mentioned, we have seen different iterations of different types of mapping, but it's been difficult to ensure the longevity. And so we do actually have sort of a first draft of the map up on our website. If Karine, you're able to screen share it,
Yeah, I can
it'd be
share
fun to
it.
show it off. But this is something we are, as an office, going to continue to work on. And so it is something that we're trying to make available to our community, but especially for feedback. You know, we're building it in process, but hopefully this is something that will be able to live on the website and in our minds for the future, and we'll be able to actually actively use this for updating. So you can see the structure is slightly different. Oh, PK?
Karine, it's really, really interesting that you're doing. We do information design in the design department, and I'm curious to know how Kumo might feed into that. More so, I'm a visual person. It's great. It's fun. These are interactive and they move around, do they?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's even more fun, I must admit. So I'm wondering from the audience, because we have a mix of graduate students, teachers. I notice Alex is here from Dean of Students. So I'm just wondering if any of you have questions or challenges for Karine.
Well, yeah, big time. But, I mean, are you done?
No,
Yeah?
it's loose. This
Oh, okay.
is Q&A, and I asked, I really like the format.
For sure. Yeah, I loved everything I saw, and systems thinking is my jam. So I guess that's like, how did you bump into that, and maybe comparing it to your studies in economics, you know, where there is a lot of linearity and rigidity. Like, how did you come to that, and how has that changed how you approach sustainability?
That's a good question. So I think it started when I took a geography course. I think it was Wicked Problems. Just full disclaimer, I didn't finish the class. I took like a week or two, and then I learned about Wicked Problems, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. And then we talked a bit about systems theory as well, so I was like, oh, this seems kind of cool. And I don't know why, but I feel like I've always had that system thinking approach, because when I was building the project, I already had a clear idea of, okay, I want sustainability in the center and I want to represent everything at the same level, right? And I think it's because when I was in college, I started playing around with what's called mind mapping. So it's very similar to what we do when we're thinking about system thinking. So yeah, I guess it just fit in terms of, yeah, looking at sustainability. And just from like how it changed my approach to sustainability, well, it made me realize that things are more complicated than we think that they are, but there's also like a lot of room for improvement, and we actually need the feedback from so many people, and everybody has like interesting ideas that they can put together. So yeah, so there's that. In economics, well, economics is a challenging discipline, isn't it, right? Because everything we do in economics is very linear, and there's not a lot of rooms for system thinking. So I'm still thinking about how we can apply system thinking to economics. I don't have an answer to that question.
Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering, in this system, what makes it greater than the sum of all these parts that we have here on the screen?
That's a good question. So I think one of the things that is lacking from this map is just the interactions between all the projects and like all the results that we get from this complex system. So for example, a couple of weeks ago, someone asked me, where do you have housing in your map, right? Housing is important when we're talking about sustainability, but you don't have it here, right? But we were talking specifically about a housing project that the CSU built, and I have the CSU in there, but you don't see the result of like, oh, the CSU is actually giving funding to students and they're able to have housing within that. So one part that is missing from this map is definitely the interactions that would make it be like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If you do have an idea of how to add like interactions within it, I'm happy to like to have a chat about it. It's just, I also was thinking about like how do you make this easy for a student audience to understand, right? So that's one of the challenges.
Thanks. And can including a geographical aspect to this type of mapping influence how we represent interactions?
I think, what do you mean by geographical maps?
Well, I mean, if different things are different, parts are interacting here, proximity and where they are based obviously is a factor. So I was wondering if including that could actually change some things within how this is mapped.
Yeah, I love that idea, and I actually didn't think about it, but yeah, that's a great idea, and I do think that it would change it, right? Because when you look at like, for example, just looking at like Loyola versus like Sir George William, right? There's a clear difference in the level of interactions between those two campuses and also like the vibrancy within every campus, right? So I do think that proximity actually plays an important role into how we interact. It's way easier to interact with an organization that is physically closer to you, right? So yeah, I do think it would change it.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll also say, like, we're lucky to have Karine's trust within our office as well, because that complexity and the sum is like a secondary layer that we're hoping to be able to apply to the map. So Karine has really prepared a lot for whoever takes on the next map. There's an entire like back end to this map with all of the text details and instructions so that it can continue to live. And so hopefully we will be able to see those sort of interactions further. You see them sort of slightly in this, but we're hoping for a more advanced version soon. And thinking of that too, Karine, in terms of design, let's say 5 years, how would you like to see students interacting with this, or how would you like to have seen the map grow?
I think the dream for me would be for students to replicate that model and play around with it. So I'm talking, for example, with students from Dalhousie University that are trying to replicate that model. So it's just awesome that people are thinking about how they can, view things as a system and think about interactions in a deeper way. So hopefully people use it to discover what is going on and to replicate it and to add more complexity, right? So we were talking about not mapping these interactions that makes it so that the whole is greater than the sum of its part. So having that added in there would be amazing.
Thank you. And thinking about that sort of interaction and collaboration, you've tried to integrate it as much as you can into the map, but I'm curious in terms of your process for creating this and designing the structure, how important did collaboration end up being?
So collaboration was very, very, very important, and this version of the map, it was very challenging to like integrate it in this version, just because you're mapping like organizations, right? So when you're thinking about connections, what you're mapping is basically the relationships between organizations, and it's very hard to, for example, if you're not working in the specific organization, it's really hard to understand how CUTV is collaborating with the People's Potato, for example. So I tried to include it as much as I could, and we've had discussion on it, but it was definitely challenging.
Do you have a question? Okay. You're all like playing musical microphones.
We talked about how important defining our knowledge or placing ourselves and making sense and having the sense of coordination of where we're heading while creating these maps. I'm wondering the part of sharing this knowledge once it's defined and once we can make it more accessible to students who maybe not have as much information, like you said, or insight about sustainability. For me, similarly, I did not speak English prior, and the word sustainability did not make any sense to me. So looking at just this map might overwhelm students, might make them feel that there's already too many organizations working on sustainability, so why should I care if there's all these organizations working on it? So my question is, how can we use maybe different departments? Like you mentioned that you had to learn how to code in order to do this project. That made me think of how can we make more students involved in these projects? Maybe we can use students who are studying communication to make it more accessible, visual art, any different department that have all of them the interests of our planet and of our climate, and together can make this more accessible to more students. So that was the part that I'm wondering about. How can we share this information with more people? We talked about having it on the website. We talked about having different even draft of it, because there's different level of complexity that people can handle. How can we make it more simpler? Because for me, when I'm talking about it with anyone or advocating about the environment, I just get overwhelmed them with the number of information that I have. I portrays this hatred towards anthropological effect on the planet, and that's not my intention. My intention is to tell people we still have the opportunity to make changes. We still care, but I don't want to overwhelm them with something complex, and I don't want to oversimplify it to make it something that not worthy enough to pay attention to. So where can we find this midpoint to share while maintaining what defined with our map?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Yeah, so I think when I designed, not this one, but the other one, not this one either. When I designed this map, the goal was for students that were interested. Let's say you're interested in food. Well, you can actually, if you hover here, if you go down, if you're interested in any of these streams, you can just click on food and it'll just take you to just food, and you get to focus on that aspect of the map, right? So the goal was to identify students that would be interested in specific sectors of sustainability and to direct them to organizations that were working in these different sectors. We're also collaborating with a couple of organizations on campus, right? So when students go to the Office of Sustainability and they can say, well, I'm specifically interested in how I can integrate sustainability within my curriculum, right? So they can share them part of the map, not everything, and tell them, look, if you're interested in curriculum and course support, well, this is what you have access to. And I really like that idea of being afraid of oversimplifying stuff, right? Because that's a big problem. And I think one of my other intent when I was building this map is, because I've done some work around like student organizing, and students tend to think that the university is not doing enough and there aren't resources available to them when they're trying to dive into the field of sustainability. So one of the idea was, let's just show students everything that is available to them, and then let them know that you can actually choose where you choose to get involved, right? And I really like your idea of just bringing more people in and being like, communication students, how are we going to make sure that this is a project that you can take on and we can get your input on that? And one of the goals when we're making this project available for everyone, there's a presentation associated to this project, and we actually have an email that people can reach out to us and be like, here are some suggestions for improvements as well. So, and just by having these types of conversations, right, we're gathering feedback and thinking about ways that we can all collaborate on this. I don't know if I answered your question.
I'll also add that I think in some ways we were lucky because Karine was designing this map in collaboration by reaching out and talking to these groups, but also within a collaborative program. So the Sustainability Ambassadors program is about peer-to-peer education. It is about sort of students having the resources and knowledge and networking capabilities to be able to connect with each other. And so, I mean, running that program, I'm really hoping that we will be able to encourage student projects to continue to work with this map, to live with it, because, I mean, Karine's given us such an amazing start, and I think part of what we're trying to do together is fight the sometimes, like, temporal limitations of being a student, because when students graduate, often their work can be like lost within the internet or within their department. And so for me, it was really important to value the effort that Karine has put in here. And you know, we've remained in communication about changes to the map, but she's also been very welcoming in terms of giving students that opportunity to try the next step. So I do think that we're at least in like a nice head start, and hopefully we'll be able to try some of those ideas you've referenced, because I do agree trying to get people engaged in sustainability can be extremely difficult without like either making it too simple or too complex. Did we have any other questions from the audience?
Oh. Excellent question, and I actually think that maybe if you're hearing that it is overwhelming from people from who don't speak English as a first language, or Concordia is very diverse, where sustainability is not on the cultural radar of someone who's coming, or even here in Quebec. I mean, there's so many people that don't even think about it. So what would be the alternative mapping? So, and in fact, sometimes as a professor and as a studying sustainability for pedagogy for university level, I do find that Concordia maybe has too many cooks in the kitchen, and that the real connections of sustainable pedagogy, interaction, collaboration is not quite there yet. So I'm just wondering whether this could maybe be something that your office or the Dean of Students, or even at my level, I'll bring to the Provost's office, the idea of multilingual. I love this mapping, but maybe it's 3 different kinds of maps as well, level 1, 2, 3. So I take very seriously that you might be overwhelmed, and it is overwhelming, not for me, but when I think about what you said, I thought yes, you're right. It could be totally overwhelming, and where can I start so I won't start? So maybe Karine and I'm sorry, I forget your name,
It's Meredith.
Mirda, could suss that, separate that or parse that out for me.
We could definitely think about ways to simplify this. So, for example, if a student is interested solely in working with peers, then we can just have a map that would highlight what are the student groups that are working towards sustainability, right? So that's removing one layer from the map. I know that the fee levy structure is very complicated as well, so maybe we could have like just a map that is just removing that. But at the same time, I mean, if you're filtering out some of these organizations, I mean, you get a more simplified map, right? So you also get that possibility of simplifying it. And some of the ways you could also adjust this presentation is just have different views, just focus on different streams or different types of organizations. I mean, there are ways that we can simplify that. Just from a multilingual perspective, it would be hard to do it. We could potentially do it. It's just a lot of work to just change everything to French, for example, which is my mother tongue, but I do feel like it would be super useful, right? And one of the conversations that I've had with someone recently is, how do you get people to be interested in sustainability, right? Where do they get this education? I'm an international student. I had no idea of what sustainability meant. People were talking about recycling when I arrived in Canada. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. This is confusing. I'm not even going to try, right? But once I started to learn about these issues and the importance of these issues, I was like, okay, this is a big deal and maybe we need to talk about it, right? And in my country, we view sustainability as, you know, maybe more peer support, right? Or how we're making sure that people are feeding each other and are able to go to school with a full belly, right? So maybe also focusing on specific ideas that are our cultural views of sustainability would be interested in, right? So I think that's when the beauty of collaboration can come in and different professors can talk about, you know, how they view sustainability in their specific field. Like I had a course about dance, and this course was strangely enough talking about sustainability and how dance can help toward this sustainable revolution. So I think there's room for everyone to have their own touch and bring their own vision to what sustainability means.
I'll also add to that that I think, you know, I think that it's also useful to not just end the possibilities at the sort of visual representation of the map. I think part of what makes Karine's presentation so interesting is her use of storytelling. You know, like she gives us metaphor, she gives us explanation, she gives us who she is when she gives this presentation, which makes the map immediately more interesting because we care about what she's telling us and we understand what she's telling us, even if we don't have an economics background, even if we don't understand systems mapping or the concept of coding. And so I also want to sort of think about what does the process of being the person who is handing the map to someone else look like? Like who are we as playing the role to share the map in the way that makes it accessible? For me, one of my first things I try to do with students is explain the difference between the university, external partners, and fee levies, because when I was a student, it took me years to understand that a fee levy and a student association were actually separate from the university. And so I think it is partially that storytelling that Karine has done such a great job of showing us is a part of how we hand the map off so that it is legible for the people that we're speaking to. And I don't think a map can ever replace the sort of conversation, community connection that gets people interested. So we are almost at the end. Did we have any other sort of community comments or questions? Looking good. Okay.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, no, I'm loving this discussion about how people would join a movement or a community or a new culture around sustainability. And I think I agree with the comments that were made earlier in terms of, oh my God, when you overwhelm someone when they show an interest in kind of making behavioral change or understanding about the environment. And I would argue that I think some of Karine's work and some of the things you've mentioned actually show that people are okay with complexity. There's some very famous systems thinkers who show most folk wisdom contains within it some grain of truth around how systems work. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Or a stitch in time saves 9. There's these folk wisdom and an understanding at a very deep level around how systems work and the interaction between multiple elements in a system. So I don't think that alone should be intimidating in terms of how we present this thing. But I think there is something to be said around connecting people based on their values or what it is that they find value in. So it wouldn't be, here's a map, find your way. It's, where are you trying to go? And then you use the map, right? It's what do you want to achieve, or what are you interested in, or why are you studying here, or what do you care about? And then that's kind of how people could connect or see themselves as part of, right, an emerging culture around sustainability. So I think that would be my contribution. I also think that simplicity is really, really hard as well. So to be able to present something that's discrete for somebody to be able to join or see themselves in it, it's not something that we're going to be good at right away, and so that's okay. Yeah, that would be my only, just as you were discussing that, I was like, when we're thinking about the map as a tool, as an approach, that it's not an end in itself, right? But that why you're talking to somebody, what connects you, and the values that you share would be kind of when you bring up the map. And it's like, well, when you know where you're going, that's when you use the map. Yeah.
Hi. First off, I want to say this is really, really fascinating. So thank you both for sharing this. And I think that we're all asking the right questions. And I'm just wondering, it's like I'm looking around. There's just a flyer on this couch for climate strike at the Hall Terrace from CJA Concordia. And it makes me wonder about, groups that are in the larger spheres of sustainability, but that don't want to be associated within the administration, and ones who serve as more of a who rely on disruption. Is there, in your experience with this resource, like not a blind spot, but is there a barrier to entry? What if these groups who are part of the ecology of sustainability at Concordia yet do not want to be recognized formally? And I wonder if you could speak to that.
So I can think of one group that comes to mind. I'm not going to mention who they are, but there was one group that didn't want to be a part of that project, and I think it's fine, right? I think we shouldn't force people to be part of an ecosystem they don't want to be a part of. As long as people know where to go if they want to get an information, I think that's what matters, right? But as a community, it's important to respect if someone wants to be excluded as well.
I'll also add a little bit, as someone from the institution, we are trying to have this map live on the part of the website that represents the Sustainability Hub, which has a variety of stakeholders. And so because of that, it's not specifically within just our office, and therefore is beholden to the Sustainability Hub community in terms of how this map lives. But I think also, disruption is such a necessary part of transformation. So I think that hopefully we'll be able to see iterations of this map that aren't living on the Concordia website, that are disrupting and transforming what this originally looked like in a way that we can't conceive of yet, and will hopefully bring us further towards that goal of sustainability. That's something I would be very happy to see.
Yeah, love that. And I was going to add that sustainability is a community work, right? We're all doing our parts, and this is my contribution, and other people's contribution deserves to be recognized, even if they don't want to collaborate, right? And that's okay. I think we're all allowed to have a space, and it's just, as long as we encourage each other, we don't have to always collaborate.
We are at 4 o'clock, so I was curious if you had any closing comments or wanted to tell us about what's next for you.
That's a good question. So for those who know me, and Meredith can attest to that, I'm someone that works a lot. I tend not to know when to take breaks, so once I graduate, I'm going to take a break, 6-month break from university. Going to travel, get certified as a yoga teacher. That's very exciting. And yeah, afterward, I'm going to start work. I'm still going to continue to explore just systems theory and system maps, and I just think it's just a fascinating world, and as an economics student, I think it's very important that we bring that type of thinking into the economic world and finance sphere. So that's something that I'm definitely going to work on in the next couple of years, let's say.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you everyone
Karine.
for being here. It was awesome to have you.
Thank you so much for joining us today for day 2 of the In.Site Symposium here at 4th Space. Just a reminder that this was live streamed and recorded, and it'll be re-uploaded onto YouTube, so you can find it later on today. Thank you so much again for joining us.